evening. Welcome back to another episode of Let's Talk About Mental Health. I'm Nels Kloster. I'm an addiction psychiatrist working in Southern Vermont.
And my name is Robert Stack, and I'm a licensed alcohol and drug counselor and a licensed mental health counselor. Hello, everyone.
Oh, yeah. And tonight we have a guest visiting us via Skype from Stanford University, Dr. Tanya Luhrmann. She is a psychological anthropologist, has written prolifically around psychiatry and issues of spirituality, and also is a columnist for the New York Times.
Well, I don't know about columnists, but they use her in articles and stuff. I don't know, they get funny about columnists and who's what, but it's great to have you on here. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right.
Good. And we thought maybe we'd start off with just a little introduction of what exactly an anthropologist does, what this study's about, and more specifically about psychological anthropology.
So anthropology as a field is basically driven by the method of participant observation. So you go to the world that you want to study, and to some extent you become a member of that world, and then you describe what you've learned as on the basis of that knowledge. So often people go off, Margaret Mead was famous for going off to Samoa. I go off to the streets of Chicago and hang out with homeless psychotic women. So a psychological anthropologist is somebody who is interested in more psychological questions and uses psychological methods along with anthropological methods to understand what he or she is studying.
Thank you. Speaking of the streets of Chicago, and I want to refer to that article that you wrote, Beyond the Brain, and it won an award, and it was about a woman in Chicago. You started off by writing about her and talking, and then went over and talked a little bit about the work that you did in India. And that's one of the things we've been talking about is different ways that people are trying to treat mental illness, especially chronic mental illness, and some of the ways to discuss that. So could you say more about that, or do a precis of that article in some way?
So one of the puzzles about schizophrenia, which is our most troubling madness, our most difficult mental illness, is that it looks as if the course and outcome of schizophrenia is more benign in India. And that's really curious because here we have, America, we have all this money, we have all these methods, and India doesn't even have much of a social service net, a social safety net to care for people. And nevertheless, it looks like the course and outcome is different. And it looks like it's the same disorder. I mean, whatever is going on in the body seems to be kind of the same. And so the question that you can ask is, why would that be the case? And one of the things that I think contributes to that is actually the culture around being an American and how difficult it is for people to accept help, and the way that we make the offer of help to people who need it. We tend to do so in a way that demands that people accept that they have a mental illness, that they know that they are in need, that they're weak, that they're not adequate. One of the things that I was doing as an anthropologist was spending time on the streets of Chicago trying to figure out whether there was a culture to the world of what some people call the institutional circuit, the world of people who are often unhoused, who are ill, who kind of tend to cycle between the hospital and the jail and the street and supported housing. And one of the things I learned is that, in fact, there is a culture. People assume that the street will drive you crazy. They're probably right. I think that we now have sufficient evidence to know that being beaten up by life increases your risk of psychosis and makes the psychosis worse. And folks in that institutional circuit, they see that the street will drive you crazy. They see that they think that the craziness is permanent. And they see it as something that can't be fixed, and so, they are, they want to send a signal to other people that they're strong and they're not going to let the street get to them, and so they resist accepting that help. And in India, there are a very different set of social factors around mental illness. People are more likely to stay with their family. People are more likely to have a job. They're more likely to be married. And there's more of people, we don't emphasize the diagnostic label. People aren't described as having schizophrenia in our country. This label of mental illness, that you have a particular mental illness, it's a very big part of what it is to struggle with mental illness. I think it's very costly for people.
So it sounds like then, I mean, part of what I've noticed is that most of us don't accept the fact that we actually have a culture ourselves. I mean, the fact that I'm a white middle-aged man, there's a certain culture with that. The fact that I'm a doctor, I have a certain culture with that. And one of the things they tried to tell us in medical school is to recognize sort of a power differential or a cultural difference. As you were talking about the experience in India, when we see in the U.S. with sort of labels, it sounds to me like we're almost in more of a culture conflict with people who want to help and people who are struggling.
I think that's absolutely right. And when you spend time with folks who are really struggling on the street, that's exactly what you see. You see the sense of, rage, irritation, a frustration with the way that the services are set up. We have a very, as the two of you know well, in any urban center, the services are often very kind of disorganized, and they change all the time, and they're often, and the services offer lovely things, but they tend to offer them in ways that are sometimes, incoherently organized for people. So you have to make a phone call, but but you can't, you can't. The temp agency wants you to call between 8 and 9, but you can't get onto a phone until 9 o'clock. You have to be at the shelter at 4, but if you go to a doctor's appointment at 2, you can't get a bus to come back by 4 o'clock, so you can get kicked out. You can get, I remember being at this drop-in center, and at a certain hour in the middle of lunch, people would run out to secure their place at the shelter and run back. And the shelter was like a block away. It was just kind of, odd that the timing had never been discussed. So you couldn't kind of organize lunch and the shelter opening at an appropriate time. It was hard for people actually to get temp work because of the rules about using public transportation and the rules about, where you needed to be when. I mean, it's tough, and we have a kind of very independent culture. People value their independence, and that's in many ways a wonderful thing. But it can make it hard when somebody is in need of help, and when it could just make it really hard.
Yeah. In my experience working in the hospital, sometimes when we were working with people who were homeless, one of the problems was their substance abuse and using other drugs, and they would get thrown out of places and they wouldn't be allowed back in because if they're drinking, they're getting a fight, they get in an argument. But one of the problems I used to have was I would try and talk to them about recovery, or I would try and talk to them about AA or going to, and they would resist it. And in many cases, they used to talk about using street drugs as a form of self-medication. And I used to struggle with that because I know it gave them some relief, but it just didn't work for them. You know what I mean? Like it didn't work long term, and it didn't work in the system. And I think that's one of the hardest about the homeless mentally ill there are programs available, but they don't fit them sometimes, or they wear out their welcome. I don't know how else to say that.
I think one of the things going on is that there is this kind of culture on the street, and then there's the culture of the treatment center, and the treatment, and it makes very good sense in a treatment center that there are rules about not having fights, and there are rules about, picking up your mess, and there are rules about, not using drugs. But, outside of the treatment center, there's a very different set of expectations, and you've got to be tough, and you've got to protect yourself, and, there's, the social world is such that, a woman may get some Social Security for, $662 a month to help her out. And she's got this boyfriend who really wants that money for his crack habit. And it's kind of great for her to have a boyfriend. I mean, you need support on the street. You need somebody to have your back. But, it's not so great if your boyfriend is wanting to take your money. But that's the sort of the social reality. So you have this tough, and outside of the treatment center, you've got to be willing to defend yourself. You've got to have this sort of sense that you are so tough and difficult that nobody wants to deal with you. So they're going to pick on somebody else. But to be, to move from that kind of world to the properly behaved world of the treatment center is not so easy.
Right.
Very much sort of an American phenomenon, or do you see this in the more developed, industrialized countries?
Well, so I don't see that in India. So you don't have, I'm speaking beyond the limits of my knowledge, but in the homeless shelter for psychotic women that I do know in Chennai, which is a great operation called the Banyan, there isn't so much of a street culture outside of the Banyan. People are, because there's less social support, there is in effect less opportunity for a street culture to emerge. So the place where I was in Chicago, there's 60 service agencies in 3 blocks square, and so there people could gravitate to there. And in India, it's a little bit more likely that you're going to die. So it's there are just fewer people. There is much less of a sort of expectation about individual rights. Individual. I'm a strong believer in individual rights. But a treatment center does not face the same issues in deciding to medicate people. They just do. We are in a world in which we expect people to know the names of their illness. We expect them to make choices about medication. We expect them to make choices about their addiction. And all of those, pretty subtle but deep cultural expectations are just formulated differently in a South Asian society.
Yeah. The article that you wrote for the New York Times and the op-ed piece on Sunday, I think it was 4 weeks ago, and it was titled Redefining Mental Illness, and that's the editor, I guess, that picks the title. Right. But anyway, the thing that really got my attention was at the end, you made a statement saying that perhaps people were moving away from medications or toward back to talk therapy. And you wrote that wonderful book of Two Minds that really in some ways said, here's what's facing us. And I've been in the field for 30-some years, so it's really become a medicine. Pharmaceuticals, it's all about getting meds. Whatever the illness is, it's about getting on meds. Anyway, I wonder if you could say more about that maybe there's a place for talk therapy in mental illness and social supports rather than the emphasis on medications.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I should say that I don't think that medications are so much a bad idea as not the only idea, and that we have evidence that medications don't solve all of people's troubles, and long-term medication may carry certain risks, and increasingly there's evidence that the social context of care really makes a difference to the way the way somebody's illness unfolds. So being safe is probably, I think, more important than being medicated. Having social relationships, having reliable social relationships, understanding the meaning of understanding how you explore the meaning of your symptoms. I think increasingly we know that's terribly important. And talk therapy provides, provides relationship, provides an opportunity to explore meaning. I think that talk therapy comes in many forms. I don't think we're going to see psychoanalysis for poor people with schizophrenia anytime soon.
Right.
But to provide people with a sense of a stable relationship with whom they can talk about their experience, I think we know that's really useful for people.
Right.
And I think we're all in agreement on that. We've said that a number of times on this show that as part of people's recovery, some sort of social inclusion or sort of a healthy group to belong to is very important. And with, for example, the Pathways to Housing program here in Vermont and around the country, the idea is called Housing First, because we know that if you don't have a safe place to live, speaking to safety, that all these other requirements, such as showing up for appointments, getting work, taking medications, are absolutely ridiculous requirements because you're setting people up to fail.
Right.
But I'm sort of curious what your thoughts are, because you have sort of put your anthropologist eye onto the field of psychiatry. How did we get to this point where sort of the DSM diagnoses and the idea of medications have taken such, I guess, supremacy in our ideas of mental health?
Well, I mean, I think it's not an accident. I mean, I think that the DSM actually picks up behavioral differences between people. That doesn't help us to necessarily understand what's going on in their brain, but there are these big behavioral differences. Cognitively, humans do better when they can categorize and organize some field of knowledge. We, as a human species, we tend to kind of, prototype or stereotype our knowledge about other people. The DSM helps us to do this. To do that, we can say, oh, this is a schizophrenic. This is a bipolar. It's just not so great for the person who has the schizophrenia or the bipolar disorder. And I think that, I think the big issue is that it's hard to treat mental illness. And, psychoanalysis had its turn. And then when psychoanalysis was not very good at treating serious mental illness, and when the biomedical revolution came around and there were all these medications, I think that there was such excitement that this was going to be it. This was going to solve the problem. And then it turns out that hasn't happened either.
And I wonder too, and I don't know if it's fair, but we had Whitaker on here, and he wrote about this the pharmaceutical industry and medicines and stuff, but it really seems driven sometimes by the industry. I mean, the medicine. And when I worked at an inpatient unit, we were very short stay, very sick people, and it was almost always to find the right med. And I understand that because they do work and everything, but it was sort of, I don't know. They used to say, well, our patients, they won't take their meds, but nobody asked them why they won't take their meds or why they stopped taking their meds. It was like holding them accountable for not taking their meds. It was sort of, instead of understanding that the meds didn't do it, it didn't work. I wonder, because time is going by so quickly, so thank you. When I started working in the field in alcoholism, we used to refer people to AA. It was what we had to offer. And we would downplay the fact that it was a spiritual program. We would say it's a fellowship, it's a group, it's everything. And invariably they'd go there and they would see God and all that. We try to explain it. And in your book, When God Talks Back, there is a point in there where they talk about addiction being this separation and a loss of connection. And I believe that. I guess my experience has been that I do think that the spirituality is part of a quality of life issue. David Brooks, a week ago, wrote an article about seculars and how they don't have a creed. They don't have this, and they have to develop one almost for quality of like who they are. I wonder if you would, and that's a long question, but could you say something about it?
I mean, it's such a deep question. I mean, I certainly don't think that people need to have a religion or need to have faith to be fully human. But I do think that a sense of meaning and ultimate purpose is, in some sense, makes us fully human. Or it's hard to be fully human without that sense of meaning and purpose and a larger frame. And so I think that, one of the things that is very hard to appreciate when from outside the mental health world is how much when somebody has a serious mental illness or a serious addiction, we live in a world which can define them with that condition. And that's all they are. They are a schizophrenic. They are an addict. And providing people, so what AA does is to try to provide them with a larger frame of meaning. It does a bunch of other things as well. I mean, it gives them a sense of an external actor who is responsible for their lives, and it gives people a community in which they find an identity and interact with people. But that, larger frame for your life is crucial. And again, and when we turn people into diagnoses only treated with medications, it's easy for folks to lose sight of that.
Right, and I think it's true. We found that antabuse, which they used to give to alcoholics, makes them sick when they drink, has never been successful.
Right.
I mean, I don't know how you want to say it. If you're forced to take it, I guess maybe on some level. Nortrexone, which gets opiate addicts sick when they use, it just doesn't seem to make the difference, because it's not, what they're seeking is not just a drug. I mean, when you're trying to help them, you got to help them with more than just blocking the drug, I guess is what I'm trying to suggest.
Absolutely.
And one of the things, and I think it sort of strikes me as something that people miss, is that sense of love, of people caring, and like you said, of a community. And I don't know how to change that. We used to have mental hospitals that had people living there. When I worked in a mental hospital, I'd sometimes say, this person would do really well if they could live here and work here. But then we did away with those institutions. I mean, I don't know. Am I wrong on that? Am I missing something?
I'm actually, kind of sympathetic to the old asylums. It's just because if you spend time with folks who are homeless and on the streets, it's like, it's terrible for people, and people are being beaten up, they're being raped, it's not as safe as it was. And we broke apart those old asylums because we thought that it wasn't good for people to be defined by the, what Goffman would call the total institution. And, and that's true. On the other hand, a monastery has its virtues. I mean, if you are part of a total institution in which you have a job and a sense of purpose, and you are, you can be working effectively, I mean, there's something to that. It's clear that some of those places were, snake pits, as they were described, but some of them were not. And it's also true that the lives that are led by many of these folks who end up kind of forced onto the street by the way that our system is set up is very difficult and terrible for people.
Right. Go ahead.
Well, I was just saying, I think that's what helps us to develop some compassion around caring for people with mental illness, is to realize that really all of us, whatever group we might belong to, are really seeking the same things. We have the same needs of, say, love and sense of purpose. And finding some kind of community, wherever it might be, is critical to wellness.
We had a guy at the hospital who had been a patient, and he cleaned the hallways and everything, and he walked around, didn't talk to many people, he ate and fed. He got in trouble for feeding the smaller animals on the campus. But it was a place for him to live. I mean, it was a good place for him. And I, like you're saying, sometimes you work with people and you say, this would be so much better if we had this place. But we don't have places like that. Well, listen, go ahead, please.
There are some of them.
Yes.
They tend to be expensive, they tend to be difficult to get into, and they tend to be, and there aren't so many of them, but they do exist.
You'd mentioned how nobody likes these labels of, you're schizophrenic, you belong in this box. But what I've noticed too with a lot of folks maybe less, severely, persistently mentally ill, that they tend to own their diagnoses and sort of own their medications. And that's always sort of struck me as intriguing when you consider the stigma around mental illness.
Mm-hmm. So that's interesting. So I think in the street culture, people are less likely to do that, or at least in my experience. But I do think that what we do for people with mental illness is that's the sort of purpose we give them, and that is, and that's terribly unfortunate. You'd prefer people not to be defined by their troubles. We prefer them to be defined by their job, by their family, by other things by their artistry. I mean, by other things that they're doing in the world.
When you do your study as an anthropologist, you want people to read it and you want people to pay attention to it. How do you see people reacting to some of the information that you gather? How do you see, well, I guess what I'm asking is, do you see changes occurring? Not just like, well, it looks like maybe we'll talk to her, but on a larger scale. Do you see any changes where people are saying, we need to do something differently?
I think there are sea changes in mental illness treatment now. I think that there's a big shift in recognizing the limits of what you could call the vulgar biomedical perspective, the sense that people are nothing but broken brains. I mean, and the medication will fix the brain. I mean, I think there's a widespread emerging awareness in the mental health world that is too limited. I think there's emerging awareness that these social interventions are helpful, that getting people free housing and not worrying so much about the rules can be more important than making sure that they're taking their medications, and might be cheaper and it might actually work more effectively. And so I think that you see with residency programs have mostly abandoned those wise old therapists. But there is a sense, what I actually think is that for younger psychiatrists, an interest in culture is replacing an interest in psychoanalysis. Is kind of the social side of struggle, and so I think there are slow changes.
This goes back to what you were saying earlier, but having a meaning in life and having a purpose in life and a community in life. And until you're part of that community, you really have to be careful about how you judge it. I'm sure that's probably a credo of anthropology or something.
Absolutely. You try to understand before you judge.
Yeah. Okay, well, now I think we do have to
Dr. Luhrmann, I think we really are out of time. And so I really want to thank you for talking to us from the West Coast earlier in the morning, and it's been really enjoyable for Robert and me.
It's been wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.